After things have fallen apart, it can be a helpful practice to go back, try to remember the stories of the beginning, or tell some stories about what it might have been like in the beginning when things went wrong. Origin stories can help us give a way to narrate the fractures of our own lives. But origin stories can also help us find comfort in who we were from the beginning, as well as reorient us so we can remember who we can still be. Now, scholars generally believe that the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, were written while the Hebrew people were in a time of Babylonian exile, a time when they were separated from the land that they knew and loved, separated from God, separated from one another, and they were separated from the kind of life that God intended for them to live. Of course, we remember the story from Genesis chapter 3 when the two humans ate from the tree of knowledge and good and evil, and their relationships were severed and curses took the place of original blessings. But if we go back a bit farther, we hear stories of beginnings, of new creations and life. Now, there's a lot that could be said about the two very different creation stories that we have in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. The first one, as you may recall, has a God who speaks creation into existence over a series of 6 days, followed by a seventh day of rest. But the second story, the one we've heard here, is significantly different. Here, God is not someone who's distant and just sort of speaks things into being, but God is like a potter, getting fingers into the dirt to lovingly form a created being, the human being. And then God breathes into the yet lifeless human, and that clay is animated by divine breath. It's a beautiful story of creation and what God, a way to imagine what God is like and what we are. And the key facet of this second creation story is the importance of connection, relationship. Now, one way to read this story, and if our whole Bible consisted only of Genesis chapter 2, it would make sense to see that this second creation story is one that is laying out heterosexual marriage as the goal of humanity. Maybe you heard that through the story. If we read more broadly throughout the broader witness of our scriptures, though, especially listening to the Apostle Paul and Jesus, that is more complicated and broader than what we have in Genesis 2. Also, experience and observation, the kinds of things that matter to us Methodist kinds of folks, teaches us that there are many forms of connection and relationship beyond heterosexual marriage that can provide meaningful and supportive lives together. So, I say all of that because I want us to focus on the deeper truth from the second creation story. And that is this, that we were made for fellowship with others. Now, I may be getting just a bit ahead of myself there, though, because in the story, before there were two humans, when there was still just one, there was almost everything needed for an abundant life. When God placed that first human in the beautiful garden, it was a fruitful place, so there was nourishment to sustain life, and it was beautiful, which we know beauty adds goodness to our lives. And the human had meaningful work to do to till and to keep the land. There was a real connection there. And there were even some rules, or I guess one rule. So the human had some clear boundaries to live within. And when God saw that it was not good for the human to be alone, which, by the way, this is just incredibly comical, God first created the animals, thinking that this might be the source of connection. But even in that, the human one had agency to name those animals. I keep hearing Bob Dylan singing, "Man gave name to all the animals." If I get around to it, maybe we'll play that this afternoon, John. But by naming the animals, the human had the power to shape the world through that naming act. There's a lot there already that we might name as marks, signs of abundant life. Good food, beauty, meaningful work, connection to the land, boundaries, agency, even God's attention. But in the midst of all of that goodness, all of that abundance, the thing that God noticed about the human is that the human wasn't satisfied. The human needed something more. Another being who was similar enough and yet distinct enough to share this life with. All the good things of creation. And yet there was no real abundance until there were others or another to share life. While Adam gave name to the animals, it's only after there is a second human that Adam finally speaks. With a minimum of 2 humans, conversation is born. Relationship finds a footing, and the sign of their connection is beautiful. Even in their nakedness, they are without shame. They are able to be who they authentically are. Isn't that beautiful? Not even their nakedness could make them hide who they were. To be seen for who we authentically are, is scary business. It's partly why I like to preach behind here. I feel like I'm safer. Maybe I shouldn't give away all my secrets. And yet authenticity is the stuff of relationships that makes life abundant. We are called to an abundant life. It's what God said. It's why Jesus said he showed up, that we might have life and life to the fullest, abundance. And of all the things that requires, most of all, abundance requires the kinds of relationships that ground us and allow us to have life-giving connections. There's a Harvard study that I think concluded recently. I don't think it's still running, but it ran for 85 years. Anybody heard about this study on happiness? It found that a good life, maybe surprisingly even, was not attained by career achievement, having enough money, exercise, or even a healthy diet. But the findings of this study suggest that relationships are the main ingredient to keep us happier, healthier, and alive longer. Quoting from the Harvard Gazette on that very study, it says, "Close relationships, more than money or fame, are what keep people happy throughout their lives," the study revealed. Those ties protect people from life's discontents, help to delay mental and physical decline, and are better predictors of long and happy lives than social class, IQ, or even genes, end quote. Now that almost sounds a bit too basic, doesn't it? 85 years, we ought to get to something a little more profound than just we need relationships, and yet, doesn't it sound right and good? Our relationships make life good. Of course, as any of us know, relationships are hard to maintain, to keep. They require constant tending and regular attention. So I have a small list of suggestions that I might offer to us. So if you blame me of never being practical, this is for you. We've said that we want to be a church that works to deepen relationships, both inward and outward. And here's a start of a list. I suggest there's a lot more that we could add, and I encourage you to do so. But as we seek to develop deeper relationships, let's do this. First, and this is the easiest, this is the low-hanging fruit. Let's make sure we learn one another's names. Now, that may seem small, but it's a big deal. I won't ask for a show of hands, but how many of you sit down the pew from that one guy who never misses a Sunday? Or you wave to that pleasant young mother across the room, but you may not even know their name. Now, I get it. If we think back to the story of the first humans and the kind of unashamed life they lived, I know that it can generate some feelings of shame to go up to a person that you've known or that you've known of for years and say, I'm sorry, I don't know that I even know your name. Do it anyway. Live authentically in community. It'll be worth it. Second, we are a church that likes to do a lot of things, which is awesome. It's a wonderful thing. But let's set an intention and make sure that before we see one another as tools to do a job, that we appreciate one another for who we are. And only second, then work to figure out how we might do something together. Even better, and this is a subpoint to my number 2, only ask someone to do those things that you know benefit both you and the other person. Now, that's the most basic point of community organizing training that I've had. Suggestion is you should never ask another person to join you in a work until you've had a one-to-one with them. Because that's the place where you can start to develop a relationship, to get to know who they are and to get a better sense of the passions that they have and the things that they care about. We can do good things together, but none of us ought to be the cog in anyone else's wheel. Third, and I'm saying this one aloud for myself primarily, but maybe it rings true for you too. Let's assume that people generally have a reason for doing the things that they do, no matter if it makes sense to us or not. Now, let me be clear. I'm not talking about justifying evil or assuming that a person who's trying to harm another human probably has good intentions. That's not what I'm talking about. But I can't tell you the number of times that I've been behind the wheel driving a car, and I've gotten mad at someone in front of me because they slammed on their brakes for some reason that I didn't understand, only to get a little further down the road and I recognized the obstruction that they were trying to avoid. That's one example, but oftentimes it can be easy to assume that a person doesn't have any sense because I don't understand why they're doing what they're doing. Am I alone in that regard? I didn't think so. People generally have a good reason for the things that they do. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt. And lastly, this is my list of 4. You may add more to it. It's good for us to connect with others. It's the things that make life rich and good. It's nice to be part of a close-knit group. But sometimes those groups can get to be a little bit too closed in. And what provides connection for us can be the very thing that might make a guest or a potential friend feel excluded, like an outsider. Be attentive to how we can make places for new people. Be aware of the insider lingo, and I'm talking to all the United Methodists in the room. We've got lots of acronyms. I trust that my list of 4 is only the start of these kinds of things, but let's foster deeper relationships among ourselves. As I conclude and as we Think back to that beautiful creation story where the goodness of connection is on full display. Consider this. Not one of us has the power to create abundance for ourselves. You can't do it on your own. And yet, each one of us can be a source of abundance for one another. May it be so. Amen.